Welcome. Over the next few weeks, all of you have been tasked with sharing stories about where God has met people in the Bible in untamed places. Let the chaos and campfire confessions begin as we meet God in the great outdoors. This is Into the Wild.
As a father of two young kids, I find myself reading a lot of kids' books these days, as you might expect. Sure, many of you have been there, or maybe you're there with me right now. I enjoy it for the most part, although sometimes my wife and I will come across a book that we absolutely cannot stand. And somehow that's the one our kids want to read most often, of course. So most of the time, we just grit our teeth, we read it anyway, even though we're just miserable doing it. In very rare instances, though, we'll be so tired of reading a particular book that we'll misplace it. So when nighttime comes and one of the kids wants to read it, we'll just be like, oh man, I don't know where that one is, but how about we read this one? Get one we actually like. Of course, the flip side of that scenario has happened as well. As it turns out, some kids' books are truly great books, full of good humor and great lessons and strangely profound thoughts, all written in a way that both the kids and the adults can enjoy. You probably have one on your mind you're thinking of. One such book that I just stumbled upon just recently, for me, is a book called A Hole is to Dig. Maybe you've heard of this book. I wouldn't be surprised if you haven't, though, seeing as though it was published in 1952. The entire premise of this book is the author, a woman named Ruth Krauss, asked a bunch of elementary school kids what they thought the purpose of various objects or activities were. For example, what is a hole for? She would ask, and the kids would say, a hole is to dig. So I'd like to read you a few of the other pages in this book, because there are some really great ones in here, funny, profound, all kinds of stuff. The first page, the very first one says, mashed potatoes are to give everyone enough. And it's a bunch of kids sitting around a table, which I thought was cool and relatable to me, because when I was a kid, that was one of like the 4 foods I would eat. So in my family, we only had enough if there were mashed potatoes, that's for sure. Dogs are to kiss people. Any dog people out there probably can relate. I did read that to somebody before today, and they just said, ew. Which, makes them a cat person, probably. This one says, hands are to hold, and a hole is to dig. This one is, the ground is to make a garden, which I know some of y'all have done before as well. Arms are to hug with, and toes are to wiggle. This one's fun. Mud is to jump in and slide in and yell doodly doodly doo. I don't think I've ever heard a child say that, ever. But to be fair, this was the early 50s, so a lot has changed, I suppose. A dream is to look at the night and see things. Snow is to roll in, which, yeah, I can see that. The world is so you have something to stand on. The sun is to tell you when it's every day. Children are to love. A brother is to help you. A mountain is to go to the top. A mountain is to go to the bottom. I like this one. A lap is so you don't get crumbs on the floor. Which, if that's true, then my kids' laps are broken because there are crumbs everywhere. Let's see, a seashell is to hear the sea. That one I think we can all relate to. Oh, here you go. Cats are so you can have kittens. Is that true, cat people? Because I wouldn't know. Not a cat person. This one is incredible. A floor is so you don't fall in the hole your house is in. Only a child would say such a thing, and it's awesome. Hands are to make things, and the sun is so it can be a great day. All of these things make sense in the eyes of a child. To them, the world was kind of made to be entertained by, enjoyed, or reveled in. Reading this as an adult, though, is a whole different experience, having developed a much more pragmatic sense of the purpose for things like a hole, which, if you ask me, is not for digging, but filling, so no one twists their ankle or runs a lawnmower into it. Or snow, which isn't just for rolling in, but for shoveling and moving out of the way so I can get to work on time. Or mud, which is not for doodling in, but for doodly, don't you dare track the mud in the house. I wonder what this book would say the wilderness is for. The wilderness is to be explored, to wander in, to start an adventure in. That might be what kids say, might be what some of you say, some of you nature types. I'd say I agree for the most part. But I think most of us would agree that the wilderness we've been talking about during this series, the hard, difficult seasons of life, that wilderness is to escape as soon as possible. That wilderness is to be avoided at all costs. Or if you've been following along and are absorbing the lessons we've been discussing for the past couple months, then a more faith-based response might say that the wilderness of life is to see God move in a powerful, mighty, miraculous way. The wilderness is to see God call a man named John from birth to play a critical role in preparing the way for Jesus. It's to equip a prince turned shepherd to lead millions of people out of slavery in Egypt. The wilderness is to rain bread and meat from heaven every single day for 40 years in order to provide for God's people. Or maybe the wilderness is to send fire down from heaven itself to prove definitively that our God is the one true God. Epic, miraculous, surprising, and loud. At least, that's how God showed up for Elijah. By far the best named and probably most handsome person we're going to look at in our Into the Wild series. That happens in 1 Kings 18. Here's the climax of this larger-than-life encounter with God. At the time of sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," maybe you know him by the name Jacob, "let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." Now, what I just did to you is a little unfair. I gave you the end of the story before the rest of it. So let me catch you up quickly. This is 1 Kings chapter 18. As is their tendency, the people of God, or the Israelites, have turned away from God and started worshiping other gods. In this case, there are all sorts of former God followers who now claim to worship or prophesy on behalf of a god named Baal. And no, Baal not B-A-L-L, but B-A-A-L. Elijah, who was a powerful and respected prophet of the actual God, wants to prove definitively that his God, or our God, is the only God there actually is. So he challenges these. He challenges these Baal worshipers to a friendly competition. And he goes like this. He says, "How about we both make sacrificial altars? I'll make one to God, and you make one to Baal. And then we're both going to set them up, but not light them on fire. Instead, you guys can call out to Baal and let him light yours on fire, and I'll do the same thing. I'll call out to God, except I'm going to cover my altar in so much water that when God actually does show up, there will be no doubt that it was him." So that's the challenge. That's what he sets up here. So they agree, these wannabe prophets, and for hours they cry out to Baal, and nothing happens. There's some funny dialogue, some taunting in there. Elijah kind of makes fun of them while they do this. A man after my own heart. Make sure you check it out on your own time. But as you can imagine, Baal doesn't show up. Nothing happens. No fire comes down despite their pleas. And then what we just read happens. God, in what may be the most epic way possible, sends fire so hot and so destructive that all the water gets evaporated immediately. The sacrifice, the wood on top of the altar, and the stone altar itself, they're all incinerated in a moment. I mean, what a crazy victory and moment for Elijah. I mean, literally, he could not have hoped for God to hear and respond to his prayer in a better way, a more effective way. Everything he wanted happened, and maybe even bigger than he imagined. And you'd be right to assume that from this point forward, Elijah is untouchable. He would be, who could ever say anything to him after this moment? The high he must have felt on that mountain, it had to be amazing. Have you ever felt like that before? Where God showed up in such a powerful way in your life that in the immediate aftermath, you felt like you were untouchable? Like your faith was solidified forever? Like no matter what came after, you'd be fine because what God just did in your life was something you'd never forget? I've talked about an experience like this in my life before from this platform, but my senior year in high school, I had the privilege of doing some mission work in China. And I've seen a lot of miraculous things in all sorts of different countries, but I'll never forget this one night in China. We got to participate in an open air, highly illegal public church service. It's illegal because it's public. And 40 people there that night decided to dedicate their lives to Christ and were saved right there on the spot. And the service was nothing out of the ordinary for me, but the passion these people felt, willing to risk so much just to worship outside, was a display of God's glory that it really changed me. I hope you've experienced something like that before. But we're honest around here. Even if you have been there, you know that feeling does eventually fade, doesn't it? The potency of that mountaintop, heavenly fire experience dilutes over time as life gets hard again, right? I mean, I know in the years since I've been to China, I've walked through plenty of wilderness. And I'm sorry to say that the memory of God's presence and power while I was there, it's not what rushes to my mind. Faced with the current wilderness that we're in, the memories of God, the incredible things he's done in the past, take a back seat. And we find ourselves overwhelmed and afraid again. And this is what happens to Elijah. Soon after his epic mountaintop experience in what is a jarring twist to his story. So this is right after. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Now, let me pause right here because this is a jarring sentence if you read it out of context. What I didn't tell you about the other stories after the altar got lit on fire and Elijah wins, I guess he decides to celebrate that victory by having all the other Baal worshipers killed right there on the spot. So there's that. We're going to keep rolling. All right. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them, i.e., I'm going to kill you." And this threat is credible because Jezebel was the wife to Ahab, the current king of Israel. And her threat is enough to scare the daylight out of Elijah, who begins to run toward the wilderness, fleeing for his life. After a day's journey, he reaches the end of his rope. And there he literally prays to God, "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. There are a lot of biblical experts and scholars that suggest that what Elijah is experiencing here is a battle with depression. To go from the highest of highs to wishing it was all over so suddenly feels like compelling evidence to support that claim. In fact, Senior Pastor Brian Hughes has used this story to talk about his own battle with depression, which you can watch anytime on our website or YouTube page, and I hope that you will if that's where you feel like you are. And the experts may very well be right. But what God showed me while I was prepping for today was maybe Elijah's apparent switch up wasn't as sudden as it feels when we read it. Because if you skip ahead a bit in his story, we see that Elijah has taken a sort of pilgrimage to a place called Mount Horeb, or Mount Sinai, you might know it by, which was a critical and really a sacred mountain for the people of God. And there, after he's had some time to clear his head and calm down, we see this. And the word of the Lord came to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." So like I said, he's had some time on his journey to clear his head, and we get to see Elijah's able to articulate why he's so distressed. And it's clear that what's hurting him isn't just Jezebel's most recent threat, but the state of how things are around him. God's very own people, who he has done untold number of miraculous things for, they've rejected him. Not only that, things are so bad that they're putting to death anyone who hasn't rejected God yet. And it's clear that this has been going on for a while now. Despite all the amazing things that God has done through Elijah, that should be undeniable proof of God's power and glory, people continue to reject him. And as a result, Elijah feels like he's the only one left who hasn't given up on God. And when I put it that way, I feel like I'm in a unique position to relate, actually. Now, not just me, but every pastor who spends time every single day praying that people would just come back to God. Dedicated pastors who plan, strategize, coordinate, scrutinize, refine, or pray over and execute all kinds of things all the time, like services every single week, social media content multiple times a day, massive mission trips for our students and adults, one of the biggest kid camps in our area every year. All of these people that are doing that constantly, they can kind of relate to Elijah. Because sometimes it feels like no matter how hard we work or pray, sweat, push, or go, there's little to no impact. Like it's fun in the moment, right? We all have the mountaintop experience. But then, so many people just forget and go back to how they were living afterwards. I want to be honest, it's hard sometimes. And I'm not just necessarily referring to our church or anything like that. I think this is true across the board, especially in the church at large, the whole church. Please don't even get me started on what feels like a growing number of massive, famous church leaders being exposed for egregious moral failures. Don't get me started. I'll get myself started if I don't move on, because it can be demoralizing. It's so hard. And look, believe me, when I say this isn't meant to be a pity party for me or the other pastors here, I mean, a major difference between myself and the Elijah of the Bible is that I know without a doubt that I'm not alone in this good work. There are way too many good pastors at PCC, both on staff and volunteer pastors, that I can never feel like it's just me, and I don't. Also, I'm not trying to say that I'm somehow perfect and that I never mess up, because believe me, that is not true. But I don't think Elijah would have said that about himself either. I think he's just tired. He's worn out. He's burnt out. He's just done. I mean, sure, he's had some of the great mountaintop experiences, but it's clear that Elijah's wilderness journey, it didn't begin when he ran away from Jezebel. It started a long time ago. And at this point, he's just reached the end of his rope. And that, I think you can relate to, probably. Maybe you've had plenty of moments in your life where you've seen God move in a mighty way. But your day-to-day existence, the grind of your life, your everyday, has you walking through the wilderness. You've been trying your absolute best to keep fighting, to keep pushing, keep praying, keep moving, keep doing all the things. And sometimes it results in the mountaintop fire from heaven experience where God's power and voice are obvious. But most of the time, you look around at your life or your circumstance and you start to think, what even is the point anymore? Maybe you've said to yourself, I've been doing everything I can, living the way I ought to, living the way I've been told to, making what I feel like are the most sensible decisions, and nothing is changing. And because of that, over and over and over again, now you feel done, tired, and burnt out. If that's where you are, then God's response to Elijah, it's for you too. Let's read more of this story together and let's unpack it. So after Elijah talks about what's going on, why he's feeling the way he is, the Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. After the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. So in 1 Kings 18 and 1 Kings 19, Elijah has two separate mountaintop experiences. This time he's with God on Mount Sinai, but they could not be any more opposite from one another. Remember, before we saw God show up in the flashiest, loudest, most over-the-top, spectacular way imaginable. The way that Elijah and you and I always want God to show up. Here, though, and this is the kind of thing that just gets me so excited when I'm reading the Bible. I hope you caught this because God deliberately does not show up in the same way. That's kind of the point. Notice that after the wind comes and the storm comes and the earthquake comes, what's after the earthquake? Fire. This would have been so resonant for Elijah, considering what had just happened to him. He just saw God in the fire, but this time, God's not in it. Instead, he's in what the NIV calls a gentle whisper. As I said, it's almost the complete opposite. But what I find even more interesting is that the original Hebrew version of this story, the Old Testament in your Bible, it's originally written in Hebrew, translated into English. If you read the original Hebrew, though, it's not called a gentle whisper there, but rather the sound of fine silence. After the miraculous fire from nowhere came the sound of fine silence. And somehow, Elijah knew that God was there. It's such a contrast to how we hope to see God, right? When we're in the wilderness, we want God, and frankly, we expect God to send down the fire from heaven and meet us there. We want him to make mountains move, giants fall, shake prison walls, chains break, split the seas, insert whatever worship song cliche you want to in this gap, some of which we sang today. That's what we want because that's what a powerful, loving, perfect God would do, right? Every situation would get solved by some sort of miracle because that's the only way we could prove definitively that it was God. But that's not the full nature of our God. Can he do that? Of course. But he's not limited to that either. What's true in both cases is this. Whether God comes in the fire or the gentle whisper, God still comes and meets us where we are. And how did Elijah know God was in the whisper? He was listening. Remember the context. Elijah had gone off by himself, away from his normal surroundings to a place where God had clearly shown up before, Mount Sinai, and listened. Perhaps you aren't listening enough in your wilderness season. Perhaps you've been caught by the temptation that tempts us all. Perhaps you're so focused on the hope of fire from heaven that you aren't listening for the sound of fine silence. The Bible doesn't say this explicitly, but I bet those former God worshipers that became prophets of Baal, the fact that it says they were former God worshipers suggests that they either saw a miracle from God in their past or heard about it from someone they cared about at one point. And because of that, they hoped in God. They worshiped God because of what God had done in a miraculous way. But then God didn't move in any sort of miracle for the next day, for the next week, for the next month, year, decade. No more miracles like that. And because they were so hyper-focused on this one way of seeing God, they lost trust in him because they felt like he had left. When really they just weren't listening for the sound of fine silence. Maybe you aren't paying attention to all of the small, gentle ways God has been working and moving and sustaining and providing in your wilderness. Maybe you need to take a page out of Elijah's book and make some room to listen. Go off by yourself, get out of your normal routine, go somewhere you've seen God move before, and listen. Because it could be that God has been speaking to you this whole time, but you just can't hear it where you are right now. And I know what probably some of you are thinking. Yeah, this is cool, gentle whisper, fine silence, whatever, but how does this actually get me out of the wilderness? So that's what we want, right? How does this solve the problem? Well, Elijah's story isn't quite over yet. There's one more piece that I think ties the whole thing together, and it's been profound for me to see. I hope it is for you too. So this whole thing happens, the gentle whisper, and then the Lord said to him, to Elijah, go back the way you came and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu king over Israel, and anoint Elisha to succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him. And this is it. The plan God has to show up for Elijah and his people in a powerful, unforgettable way. The next mountaintop experience that'll bring Elijah's wilderness journey to an end. No, not this part right here. I'm not talking about God revealing that Elijah isn't alone and that there are 7,000 more just like him that God is using. I mean, it's cool, and that's something that must have felt great to Elijah, but that's a message for a different day. No. The plan is a succession plan. What? Could there be anything more boring, more tedious, less sexy, more mundane? Probably not. But that's the point this section is trying to make. And really, I think it's the culmination between both of the chapters, both of these mountaintop experiences that we've been working through. And if you don't hear me say anything else, just hear me say this. God is not limited to, nor does he appear to us in just one way. Sometimes God is made known through the spectacular loudness like fire from heaven. But sometimes God is known through the quiet working out of history like a successor. You see, it would take this succession plan years to reach its end. But the result of that end would solve the problem Elijah was facing. Elijah would leave the mountain right after this. He would go find Elisha to deem him successor right away. But years down the road, in a whole different book of the Bible, after Elijah is gone, by the way, Elisha is the one who would appoint Jehu king. And Jehu would go on to eliminate Jezebel, the perpetrator of false god worship and prophet killing among God's people. God had a plan, but it wasn't a flashy one. Because sometimes God is made known through the spectacular loudness, but sometimes God is known through the quiet working out of history. Sometimes God is made known to us through a miraculous healing from something devastating, from something that just won't go away, from something that we were told we would never recover from. God sometimes does show up like that and eliminate it. But sometimes God is known to us through the friend who drives us to the appointment each day. Sometimes God is known to us through a marriage coming back from the brink of disaster, something that neither person thought was ever going to happen, and it being made whole again. But sometimes God is known to us through a counselor who listens and cares. Sometimes God is known to us through a major financial breakthrough that you've been just hoping for, praying for a long time. And sometimes God is known through having just enough to make it through that day. Whatever wilderness you find yourself in today, don't give up the fight. Keep pushing, keep moving, keep going, because God is moving too. He hasn't stopped, and neither can you. Resist the temptation to only look for God in the spectacular loudness and listen for him in the sound of fine silence. The mundane, the routine. Because he is there and he's speaking. Just a moment, our service will be over. But before we go, I thought that maybe we need to make a few edits to our wilderness section of A Hole is to Dig. See, because maybe it's not what we said before. Maybe the wilderness of life isn't to escape as soon as possible or to be avoided at all costs. Maybe the wilderness is to rest, to slow down, and to listen. The wilderness is to see the wind and the rain, to feel the earthquake, and to see the fire. The wilderness is to know that God isn't always there in the spectacular, but to know he's in the gentle whisper sometimes too. To know he's in the sound of fine silence. The wilderness is to see God in the quiet working out of history. To see him in the mundane. To see him in the routine. The wilderness is to be reminded that even there, God is moving. To be reminded that he has a plan. To be reminded that you're not alone. The wilderness is to keep pushing forward, to keep fighting, to keep moving. The wilderness is to see that God has always been there, shaping you into the person you were always meant to be. So maybe the wilderness is to listen. Thank you so much for being here today. We will see you next week.